As Farouk said, I'm going to be speaking today about the naturalist gaze, and essentially it's a very simple idea. Naturalists are observers. All of us that go out into the wild, into the forests, into the deserts along the coastlines of India are observing nature in its many diverse forms. And what interests me is the way in which, first of all, we observe nature, and then the way in which we interpret it. And by interpretation, I mean the way in which we represent it in art, the way we represent it in storytelling, the way we represent it in science, folklore, and so many other forms of narration. I'll be talking today primarily about some of the themes and the ideas that appear in two of my books. My most recent book, The Cobra's Gaze, Exploring India's Wild Heritage, that will be the primary source for a lot of the stories and the images that I'll share, but also Wild Himalaya, which came out about 4 or 5 years ago and traverses the entire range of the Himalaya from Kashmir to Arunachal Pradesh, and looking again at the wildlife, the wild heritage of those mountains. Now, when I started writing The Cobra's Gaze, what the real inspiration was a short walk that I took on this hill, Flag Hill, which is right near my home in Mussoorie. It lies about 15, 20 minutes from my backyard, and it's a place that I love to go to appreciate nature, get away from the crowds, and enjoy the solitude of the mountains as well. Several years ago, right after the monsoon, I set out for the north side of Flag Hill, hoping to photograph a small plant called Drosera peltata, which is one of the few insectivorous plants found in the Himalaya. It feeds on minuscule insects. It's also known as sundew. And I had written about it before, but I wanted to get a photograph. So I set out at the end of the monsoon, which is the perfect time to try and find it. And I was walking very slowly, carefully along a ridge on the north side of this mountain. And as I was walking along, I suddenly felt that I wasn't alone. And it was a strange feeling, a feeling of premonition, a feeling of reassurance as well. And as I looked up, in front of me was a stunted oak tree that had 2 forking branches. And through the forks of those branches, I saw a goral. A goral is a goat antelope, one of the most common mammals in this part of the Himalaya. And he was about 2 meters away from me, 2.5 meters away on the other side of the oak. And he had been focused on the grass as well, obviously feeding on the fresh green grass at the end of the monsoon. And the two of us looked up and locked eyes for several long seconds. And it was, for me, a profound experience, a moment of shared consciousness, in a sense. I can't speak for the goral, obviously, but for me, it was a moment in which here was I, one species, looking into the eyes of another species, and the two of us were both acutely aware of our own presence in that particular place. It was, for me, an almost mystical moment. Very slowly, I lifted the camera. I didn't even put the camera to my eyes, and I snapped this one picture. As soon as I snapped the picture, the goral gave an alarm call, and it went running down the side of the hill and disappeared. And I stood there for several moments, absorbing the significance of that moment, absorbing that overwhelming sense of being part of nature rather than standing away from nature or apart from nature. One of the phrases that has fascinated me over the years came from a book called The Hunter's Trance. And that title itself, it's a book by a writer named Carl van Essen, and it's intrigued me for a long time. The idea of the hunter's trance is that in that moment when the hunter, the archer, pulls back the bowstring, as we see in this photograph from Bhutan of the archer intently focused on his target, both the archer or the hunter and his prey become one. And again, it is that sort of a mystical moment of a kind of epiphany that occurs just before the arrow is released. Obviously, this archer is aiming at a target, not at the sarau on the right-hand side, but this is a sarau related to the goral, a larger species of goat antelope that is found in Arunachal Pradesh. So that idea of the hunter's trance has been with me for a long time. And what was interesting in the entomologist and famous biologist E.O. Wilson, who wrote a book called Biophilia, which is about our relationship as human species to other species around us. He took this idea of the hunter's trance and he rephrased it as the naturalist's trance. And he talks about the way in which he is walking through a forest in Suriname, looking for a rare species of ant. And as he turns over the leaf litter and sees the ants there, it is this wonderful sense of communing with nature, being connected to the natural world, and as an observer, not only just looking at that natural world, but having the natural world look back at us. And one of the things that is very important for us to understand when we go to national parks, tiger reserves, or other wild places in India is the fact that when we are looking at these species, like this black buck in Dal Chapar Wildlife Sanctuary in Rajasthan, we're looking at him, but he's looking at us, and he's observing us with some of the same senses, but also with obviously a much more acute sense of smell and hearing. And as we watch these species observe us, as naturalists, as conservationists, we appreciate their beauty, we appreciate their significance, we appreciate their rarity as well. But we are also looking at them, I think, with some of the same instincts that we inherited from our ancestral hunter-gatherers. As a naturalist, you use many of the skills, the understanding of nature that early hunters had, whether it's seasonality, whether it's the direction of the wind, whether it's being able to read the spoor on the ground. And the one thing that I think we often forget today as conservationists is that no matter how committed we are to protecting these other species, no matter how compassionate we are towards other animals like this black buck, the black buck is not looking at us in the same way. The black buck is looking at us primarily as a predator and looking at us to try and decide what sort of threat we pose and whether he should flee or how soon he should flee. When we see other species like this spot-bellied eagle owl in Netravali Wildlife Sanctuary in Goa, for me to be able to see this owl, I have to shine bright lights up into the leaves, illuminate the canopy of the tree, and then only can I see and photograph this species, because I am not a nocturnal species. My eyesight is not adapted to seeing things in the dark, whereas the owl is quite the opposite. This owl is absolutely attuned to the forest at night. His eyesight is absolutely developed to a certain point where he can navigate, hunt in the dark. Another species that I look at and wonder about what he is looking at, what he's thinking, how he's interpreting me, is this lion-tailed macaque, a rare species of monkey from the Western Ghats, from the Sahyadri Range. Unfortunately, this photograph is of this lion-tailed macaque standing on a parapet wall begging for food from tourists, which is a fundamental problem in wildlife management. But as I look at him, because we are both primates, because we're distant cousins, you might say, there is much in him that I recognize of myself. It may be that I'm a gray-haired old man, and he also has a gray beard, and perhaps that is something that creates a bond between us. When I showed this photograph to my son several years ago, he immediately said, "This macaque looks like Karl Marx." And I cannot look at this photograph without recalling that comment, because he does look a certain bit like Karl Marx. But as we look at other species, there are some species that obviously are closer to us, and we recognize something of ourselves in them. What I have to ask myself is, as this macaque looks at me, does he recognize something of himself in me? And I can't answer that. Now, much of my writing, much of my travel has focused on the Himalayan region. And this is a photograph of Ladakh, looking actually at the north side of the Himalaya from across the Indus during winter when there is a certain amount of snowfall. Most of the rest of the year, it's a very dry and arid landscape. One of the things that has always fascinated me about Ladakh are the petroglyphs. These are rock art that are found throughout Ladakh, primarily along rivers and along travel routes going back several centuries. And early hunter-gatherers scratched images of wildlife on the surface of these rocks, as you can see in this photograph. We don't know why they carved these images on the surface of the rocks. It may be simply to signal to others that these are the species that are found in this area. There may be some sort of spiritual motive behind it, or the idea that perhaps a shaman might have carved these images in order to invoke the presence of these species and success in the hunt. We don't know. We can only imagine and guess at the motives. But I do like to think of these images really as the first field guides to Himalayan mammals. We also don't know how long ago these were etched on these rocks. My guess is that when the last ice age ended about 10,000 years ago, and the glaciers and the ice cap began to retreat, wildlife began to move into the valleys, places like Ladakh, out of the Tibetan Plateau, which was not glaciated, and they moved further and further as the ice retreated. And of course, pursuing them were human beings, hunter-gatherers, who followed them into the Himalayas, some of the first inhabitants of the Himalaya. So whether it was 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, these images come to us from the Stone Age. And in those images, we can recognize many of the species of wildlife that still exist in Ladakh. This is an Urial ram, a wild sheep that is common in Ladakh. As you can see, he's watching me too. I love the shape of his eyes and the way they are outlined in black, almost as if he has kajal around his eyes. And these species, we can recognize them in those petroglyphs. When we look at the petroglyphs, they appear almost naive and childlike. This is an image of an ibex. It's immediately recognizable because of the long curved horns on top. But if we look at it carefully, we realize that the person who carved this, the artist or the hunter that carved this on the rocks, had firsthand knowledge of this species. If you look at the shape of the tail, you look at the shape of the body, the position of the ear behind the horns, the beard under the ibex's chin, you know that the person who drew this had seen ibex firsthand, was familiar with this species. It isn't a fanciful drawing. It is a rendition of the ibex that we see in Ladakh even today. And you can see exactly where the ears are positioned, the shape of the tail, the beard, that artist reproduced on those rocks. Here's another species. If you can see it on the left-hand side of the image, carved on the surface of this rock, is a snow leopard. It's easily recognizable, partly because of the spots on the body, the long tail, the shape of the body. It's a somewhat stylized image in terms of the shape of the head, but nevertheless, it is immediately recognizable. And of course, we know that the snow leopard is a species that is found in Ladakh and other parts of the high Himalaya. I'll give you a moment to see whether you can spot the snow leopard in this image. Take just a moment if you haven't spotted it yet. Keep your eyes focused on the different shapes. And when you see it, I can guarantee that you cannot miss it. It's in the upper center of the photograph, crossing the snowfield there. This is a closer shot of this same snow leopard. This shot was actually taken using an iPhone through a spotting scope that magnified the snow leopard considerably more than my binoculars or my camera could do. And you get a sense that not only is it suited to a world of snow, but it's also beautifully camouflaged and fits into this landscape of rocks and dry soil as well. 1,500 2,000 kilometers south of Ladakh, we come to another very important site for rock art, which is Bhimbetka, just south of Bhopal in Madhya Pradesh. It's a ridge of the Vindhya foothills with these eroded rock formations and rock shelters. And these rock shelters, archaeologists tell us, are some of the oldest continuously inhabited shelters in the world, going back as early as 100,000 years ago. And on these walls, naturalists, the early hunters, also painted or drew images of wildlife. And you can see a procession of creatures going across the upper part of this rock shelter. Here's a closer shot. Now, what is interesting here for me is not only the fact that we can recognize certain species that still exist in this part of Madhya Pradesh, but we can also recognize species that used to be in Madhya Pradesh, in this area of central India, and no longer are found there, whether it's wild buffalo, whether it's gaur, whether it is elephants. And for a naturalist, not only are these beautiful representations of different creatures from thousands of years ago, but they are also a record of environmental change, ecological changes that have taken place over time. And as a naturalist, as a conservationist, as a wildlife scientist, there's a great deal that we can learn from these images. Now, as I said before, naturalists are observers, but naturalists are also storytellers. Hunting tales are some of the earliest tales of natural history. But as you can see in this image from Bhimbetka, a famous image on the walls of Bhimbetka, which is a large exaggerated boar. It's exaggerated in the sense that it has been given horns to give it an even more monstrous appearance. And obviously this boar was a part of a story told by hunters. You can see the hapless hunter being chased by this boar in the foreground. He's running away as the boar bears down on him. So you can imagine how this story was embellished, exaggerated, told time and again. And you can almost imagine the family that living in that rock shelter, sitting there in the firelight with the elders of the family pointing to the different figures and recounting those stories. Probably a group of wide-eyed children sitting to one side, absolutely fascinated and perhaps terrified by this monstrous boar. In India, we have a long tradition of using nature to tell stories or adapting natural history into mythology and into folklore. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see a serpent eagle. A serpent eagle is one of the common raptors found throughout India, all the way from Arunachal Pradesh to Karnataka and in the Himalaya as well. And the serpent eagle, as its name implies, is a raptor that feeds primarily on reptiles and more specifically on snakes. Now, on the right-hand side, we have the Garur figure or Garuda figure. This is from Tawang Monastery in Arunachal Pradesh. In a Buddhist tradition, Garur is shown again as the enemy of serpents, or he preys upon serpents, and you can see very clearly how he has this snake in his beak. So we take the natural behavior, the diet of this particular raptor, and it gets transformed into the story of Garur, who is the enemy of snakes, though he is also the Vahana of Lord Krishna, and has many, many myths and stories told about him in Hindu tradition, but also in Buddhist tradition. The elephant probably features most prominently in mythology, more than any other species we have here in India. The elephant is a well-loved creature in storytelling. It's a creature that is associated with water. We have everything from wonderful poem Meghdut or Meghduta, in which the cloud shaped like an elephant travels over the earth. We have so many stories of Airavat, Lord Indra's Vahana, and so on and so forth. on the right-hand side, this is a tusker, by the way, in Nagarhole National Park in Karnataka. On the right, many of you will recognize the famous sculpture at Mahabalipuram. It's a rock sculpture, in a sense, in the tradition of those petroglyphs that we saw earlier, but obviously a far more sophisticated image and more complex imagery is employed there. This is sometimes referred to as Arjuna's penance, but I think most archaeologists now agree that it depicts the descent of the Ganga. And you see all of the deities that have gathered to welcome Ganga to earth, to witness this profound moment. We have King Bhagirath on the left side of the channel with his arms above his head, performing tapasya that he did for thousands of years in order to persuade Ganga to come down from the sky. And in amongst all of those deities and demigods are wild creatures. It's a wonderful juxtaposition of mythology and natural history. In the channel that we see, which is where the Ganga descends, it's a natural channel in the rock. The Nagarajas are depicted there. There's also right at the bottom a cobra at the root of that channel. We have monkeys, we have deer, we have lions, we have tigers. We even have a small cat in the bottom left-hand corner of the channel that is imitating King Bhagirath, a sort of mischievous addition that the sculptures gave to this. Now, as I said, storytelling is very much a part of natural history, and I've been very fortunate in that after I finished writing The Cobra's Gaze, my publishers suggested to me that I write some books for children. And I've written for children before, but never consciously writing about wildlife. And it was a wonderful experience to be able to tell stories that I hope appeal to younger readers and give them an appreciation for natural history and wildlife. They've been beautifully illustrated by an artist named Mohit Suneja. This one is If You Were a Tiger Cub. And then this one also illustrated by Mohit Suneja, How the Cobra Got His Spectacles, which again deals with the idea of how different creatures perceive us and other species in the wild. The cobra, ironically, the cobra's eyesight is actually very poor, and the cobra really experiences the world through its tongue as it picks up scent particles in the air, transfers them to an organ on the roof of its mouth, and that through that process has an awareness of its surroundings and of other species there. Anthropomorphism is something that obviously scientists try to avoid. We try to avoid giving tigers pet names. We try to avoid transferring our own human qualities, our human emotions onto other species. And it's certainly something that, as a writer of natural history, it's something that I've avoided. But nevertheless, in children's literature, writing for younger readers, there is an opportunity to play with that idea of anthropomorphism. And here we have one of the scenes in this book where the cobra imagines itself becoming a man, just as there is a man imagining himself becoming a cobra. And this very dramatic illustration that Mohit Suneja has done for the book. Traveling with mythology, traveling with storytelling to a very different landscape, a different part of India. Here we are in Gujarat, in Saurashtra, and this is Mount Girnar, the highest peak in Gujarat. It's a sacred mountain. You can see there are many temples and shrines, the summit and the lower slopes of this mountain. And there's a wonderful story that I heard when I visited Girnar not too long ago when I was working on this book. And the idea was that when the earth was created, mountains had wings, and mountains flew from spot to spot. They were not fixed on this surface of the earth, and they moved about with a certain fluid. They migrated from one place to the other, which in itself is a fascinating idea. But of course, at a certain point, Brahma decided that this was getting a bit too chaotic, and he needed to bring order to the earth. And so he sent Lord Indra to chop off the wings of each of these mountains. And most of the mountains, they had their wings chopped off and they were fixed in that particular spot. Mount Girnar, understandably, did not want his wings chopped off, so he hid in the sea. And then through the trickery and the machinations of the deities, he was then lured out onto the shores of Saurashtra, and his wings were chopped off, and this is where Girnar stands. Girnar is also very important to us because of the Ashoka edict that is carved on a large granite boulder at the foot of Mount Girnar in the town of Junagadh, which is the settlement at the foot of Mount Girnar. And this rock edict, like many of the Ashokan edicts, has inscriptions in Brahmi script exhorting us to protect wildlife, to not kill or sacrifice animals, and to propagate herbs, medicinal herbs that can be used to heal the ailments of animals as well as human beings. I like to think of these inscriptions as the first Wildlife Protection Act of India. We usually think of the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. This was several thousand years before that. I also sometimes fancifully like to think of this rock, this huge granite boulder, as one of the wings of Mount Girnar that was chopped off and landed on this particular spot. Of course, Ashoka we associate with many different stories, many historical events, but primarily we also associate Ashoka with the lion capital, which is the emblem of our republic. The three lions above the chakra with the different species of animals circling around at the base is very much a political narrative and starts from natural history, evolves through mythology. The lion's roar was sometimes equated with the Buddha's sermons, the roar of the lion being this roar of truth and authority. And in a sense, then it became a political symbol, and we find it now on coins, government stationery, and so many other documents. Now, Girnar is obviously close to Gir National Park, and Gir National Park is famous for the only sanctuary for the Asiatic lion, which is found in these forests. It's in a sense, also a political story, because for years the Nawab of Junagadh protected the lions and refused to let others hunt them, and the lions dwindled in population, less than 100, and then now, through the efforts of the Gujarat Forest Department and other individuals and institutions, the lions have rebounded so that we now have anywhere from 600 to 700 lions still in Gujarat. And Gujarat is obviously rightly proud of these lions and possessive of the lions. And so efforts to relocate some of them in recent years have failed because the government of Gujarat feels that these are their species, their wildlife, and represent their authority and their political power, in a sense. This lioness, this female lion, I happened to see while I was bird watching in Gir. I had gone for 2 safaris hoping to see lions and didn't see them. And then I was on foot early morning, and I came around this acacia bush, and there were 2 female lions lying about 20 feet away from me, watching me as I watched them. There was no aggression or no apparent aggression in their expressions, though they clearly were watching me intently, even as I was watching them with a certain level of anxiety. Now, one of the things that has fascinated me for years, and that has sort of come into focus in the Cobra's gaze, is the way in which human beings give spiritual or sacred attributes to different species. And the cobra is obviously one of those species. And as you can see in these votive stones at the foot of a peepal tree in Karnataka that have been worshipped, flowers have been left there as a symbol of veneration. They've been dusted with turmeric and other vermilion powders. These snakes are not just snakes, they have been transformed in the human imagination into something sacred, something more powerful than ourselves, and something that we venerate and offer our devotion to. The Naga cults, the Naga deities, are some of the oldest religious icons found in India. These are images from the Mathura Museum in Uttar Pradesh on the Yamuna. We have a Nagaraja figure on the left with the multiple-headed cobra above him. We have a Naga couple in the central image. And then we have a Jain Tirthankara figure under, again, the cobra's hood. And archaeologists, again, tell us that these are some of the earliest deities that were worshipped in India and obviously come from an awareness of cobras in the wild, the presence of cobras. One of the things I think that we do when we look at wildlife is obviously observe it on many different levels. We have a fascination for snakes. This is a sapera with a cobra in the back streets of Mathura, the same town where those Naga figures are on display in the museum. This was actually on Nag Panchami, the festival that when cobras are worshipped. And there is this fascination of this rather brave gentleman who wants his selfie taken with the cobra there. That fascination for the snakes, by the way, all of this is entirely illegal with the Wildlife Protection Act. Keeping cobras in captivity, displaying them in public is entirely illegal. This was being done very surreptitiously in the back lanes of Mathura, and the sapera quickly, once he'd collected donations, put his snake in its basket and disappeared down the street. When I was writing The Cobra's Gaze, I had given the title to my publishers, and they seemed to appreciate the title. I was faced with a fundamental problem, which was that now I had to find cobras and see them in the wild. And on the advice of many people, I traveled to the Western Ghats here at Agumbe in Karnataka, one of the wettest places on Earth, not quite as wet as parts of Meghalaya, but it receives as much as 7 meters of rainfall annually. Sometimes that goes up to 11 meters of rainfall. So you have these beautiful rainforests on the slopes of the Western Ghats, full of wildlife and full of different kinds of reptiles, amphibians, and of course, a whole range of birds and other animals as well. And one of the interesting things about the Sahyadri is that there are numerous sacred groves found in these mountains. This is a small sacred grove on the campus of the Agumbe Rainforest Research Center or station, where I based myself when I was in Agumbe. And you can see these very simple rock that have no carving on them or anything, but are venerated as forest spirits, forest deities in amidst this tangle of foliage. The forest itself is the sanctuary, the temple. At the Agumbe Rainforest Research Station, one of the primary forms of research is rescuing cobras. So the director, Ajay Giri, often receives calls to let him know that a cobra has entered someone's home or has been found near habitation, and then he goes and rescues the snake and then releases it in the wild unharmed. This was a cobra that had entered a hen house and it had swallowed 8 eggs. The chicken had fled, and the cobra swallowed the 8 eggs. Ajay, using his hook, expertly caught the cobra and then transferred it to a canvas bag, and then it was released in the wild, not too far away from where it was found. And you can see, if you look closely, the eggs that the snake has swallowed. It looks like beans in a pod. I made 2 trips to Agumbe, the second one during April, when the king cobras breed. And Ajay again had very kindly invited me to come at that time. And sure enough, as soon as I reached there, there was a call, and this king cobra had been found in a half-constructed building about 20 kilometers away from the Gumbe Rainforest Research Station. And Ajay was able to rescue it and release it into the wild. Unlike the spectacle cobra, which may be 4 feet long, this king cobra was about 12 feet long. And I was very fortunate when I was there to be able to observe the breeding behavior of these king cobras. During the breeding season, the male cobras engage in what is referred to as combat. It's basically a struggle for dominance between the two male snakes. It actually looks as if they're mating, though because their bodies are entwined. It reminds us very much of that image of the entwined cobras on the votive stones, and obviously is the inspiration for that. And we watched these two male cobras, both of them over 12 feet long. It wasn't a violent combat. They basically press down upon each other's head, trying to subdue the other snake and make it flee, make it give up. And it's sort of a wrestling bout that takes place, though it often looks somewhat like a dance to a human observer. The fascinating thing about this is that the snakes are completely unaware or unresponsive to our presence while they are engaged in this combat, so that we could be standing 2 or 3 feet away. Cobras have poor eyesight. King cobras also have relatively poor eyesight. But the other thing is they are completely deaf. So they do not hear our voices. They do not hear us exclaiming over the fascinating behavior that we are watching on display during the breeding season like this. I often think that one of the reasons why we assign sacred attributes to different species is a combination of awe and fear. Because when we see a snake like this, when we see these cobras, they are remarkably beautiful. The movement is beautiful, the coloration is beautiful. They are a spectacular species, totally different from our own, and yet fascinating in so many different ways. But combined with that awe and fascination, there is an obvious sense of fear because they are venomous. We have an inbuilt, I think, instinctual fear of cobras and other snakes. And it is that combination of awe and fear that I think creates a sense of sanctity in this particular species, a sense of spiritual or mystical associations. These two snakes were in the forest, but it was a forest very close to a village. And here you can see the villagers in the small village of Konakadu in Karnataka, watching the two snakes as they perform this breeding ritual, taking photographs, certainly not harming them. And fascinating for me was when we were there in the village, they invited us to come to a puja, which would be taking place the following day. And the puja was at a Nagavana, or Nagavana, which is a sacred grove dedicated to a cobra deity, very similar to the Nagarajas that I showed you earlier, and that this would be a special puja, and that there would be an oracle coming who would be possessed by the snake. So obviously, I accepted the invitation, and it was fascinating to watch this ritual in which this human being took on the characteristics of a snake. He threw himself onto the ground. He wrapped his legs together the way the two snakes were entwined, and then he squirmed and writhed around the shrine itself, just like a snake. And of course, there was music, the saxophone, the drums, the gongs, and a lot of excitement in the crowd as they watched this oracle possessed by the cobra deity. He had the flowers of an areca nut palm pressed to his face, And then when he eventually stood up and looked at the rest of us and then began to answer questions from the audience, the inflorescence of the areca nut palm looked like scales on his face and body. And you can see his gaze as he performs this religious theater with great passion and intensity. It really was a moment in which I was able to get a sense of that long-standing connection in India between natural species, the mythology that we assign to it, and our rituals and beliefs today. I'll end simply by saying that to remind you again that when we look at wildlife, we observe it, we tell these stories about the different creatures, but we must never forget that the wildlife is looking at us. This somber deer, just like that kural I saw early on, is looking at me just as I am looking at it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It was a fascinating journey, just to put it in one word. Before we go on to the questions, I'd like to read out the compliments that you've collected. Let's see. Okay, lovely storytelling, inspiring, enriching. I'm just reading out the keywords. Somebody wants to know which of your books are specifically for children. Could you answer that?
Well, there are 3 that are coming out within a week or 2. One is the Cobra, how the Cobra got his spectacles.
Correct.
And If You Were a Tiger Cub, and I think the 3rd is A Little Lost Elephant. So those are just about to come out. Those are for younger readers. They have a number of illustrations in them. So those are there. But I did write a book called The Secret Sanctuary, which was actually about the Jabbercate Nature Reserve. I showed you the photograph at the beginning there. And it's an imagined story of children in that place. And it was really to encourage children to explore the Jabbercate Nature Reserve. So The Secret Sanctuary is, of the books that are out there right now, is the one that probably focuses most completely on wildlife and our wild heritage.
Staying with the compliments, thought-provoking illustrations, detailed journey through Mother Nature. Here's another one. The Alter family is truly artistic. Tom Alter is his cousin. Somebody was telling that to the other participants today. Jing Sakerkar says that she was fortunate to visit Bhimbetka, and the visit was recommended by the director of Bhopal Museum. It's absolutely fascinating, and she recommends it highly for the cave paintings.
Oh, I think anybody who has a chance to see Bhimbetka should. Just as I think anybody who gets a chance to see the Mathura Museum must see the Mathura Museum. I mean, those are 2 very different, but 2 reliquaries of the past that are just spectacular.
Wealth of knowledge, says Sabira, and she recommends you for the Padma Award.
Oh, very kind.
Avi says that she's always viewed wildlife from a naturalist perspective, but you're adding Indian mythology perspective is very interesting, and thank you. Again, compliments. Presented a unique angle with archaeology, folklore, and mythology, which was very apt for a country like ours, putting it in the context of scientific evidence. Yes, somebody wanted to know if your books are available on Audible.
Some of them are. I honestly can't give you a list of which are Audible books.
Okay.
I think primarily it's my novels that are available as audiobooks. I'm not sure that Wild Himalaya or The Cobra's Gaze is available yet as an audiobook. Probably not. Probably not.
Jyoti says that she's fascinated by this concept of sacred groves. And have you captured more about them in any of your books? And if yes, which one?
Yes, well, there's a whole section in The Cobra's Gaze which is about sacred groves, and I just touched on it very briefly in the talk today, but I traveled to different parts of India, obviously, and for me, what was fascinating is that sacred groves are not something that is just specific to the Sahyadri. There's a sacred grove in Haryana, right near Gurgaon, and between Gurgaon and Faridabad, called Mangarbani, which is an acacia and dried deciduous forest that's protected. The sacred groves in Meghalaya are some of the most beautiful and spectacular groves there that have a whole tradition that is very different. And each of the sacred groves has its own stories, its own deities. Coorg or Kodagu is a place that has probably more sacred groves than any other place in India. And what's fascinating there is the ways in which the different deities are revered, venerated, but in the context of biodiversity. So the idea, we're used to going to a temple and being surrounded by iconography, by mythology, by sacred narratives that are there. But when you go to Kodagu and you enter these sacred groves, it is like going into an environment that is just so lush and so diverse. And it is that diversity and that lush sense of abundant life that really gives it that sense of sanctity. But each one is different. It's not as if it's a repeated formula. There was one of the fascinating things was there's a certain deity, Ayappa, who's a specific Ayappa to the Kodagu region, not the Ayappa of Sabrimala, but he is the hunter deity. And he is venerated. There's no image of him. There'll be a representative stone, but then devotees will leave terracotta hunting dogs as offerings to him. And these little hunting dogs are there at the base of the trees near his shrine. So there are these wonderful stories, all of which, in a sense, speaks to a tradition of conservation that is very localized and yet is historical and goes back millennia in India.
Sabina Fernandez says that you are David Attenborough in the flesh.
You're very kind. I think we need to dispense with the compliments. I
No,
appreciate
it is my duty to read it out to you, David.
But you're very kind. Thank you, Sabina.
And Pratiti concurs. She said that it was great hearing you at the Lit Fest in Calcutta recently.
That's right. That was this last winter, I think.
Okay, here is a question which your response would be greatly appreciated. How do you see the huge challenge to make the average Indian more aware of protecting and safeguarding our wildlife?
That's a huge question, and I'm sure a lot of people have scratched their heads over that. But I think at the heart of it, most people have an appreciation for nature. They just aren't. It may not be their first priority. They may also not feel that they know how to respond to nature. I mean, many people are terrified of tigers and don't want to go out in the forest. People are certainly scared of cobras and don't want anything to do with them. How you get people over that instinctual fear, I suppose, is one of the first hurdles that's there. But also, I think fundamentally to try and make it a priority, because there are so many issues, there's so many problems that we face, not just in India, but throughout the world. And to be able to say, well, we should protect, a particularly rare species of salamander in a rainforest in Goa. How does that measure up in the popular imagination as a priority as against building a highway or building a dam? Those are things that take a lot of persuasion, a lot of thought, and I'm not sure I have the answer to that. But the encouraging thing is that there's a whole generation of younger naturalists out there who are totally committed, and I think it's really in their hands. I was fortunate just a few weeks ago to be in Bengaluru speaking to a group of conservation students. And as I said to them, they are the future of conservation in India. And if anybody's going to be able to persuade the rest of the country to protect and preserve wild places, it's them. And the encouraging thing is that they are absolutely dedicated and full of passion for this.
So how did you personally get over the fear? Somebody was referring to the picture of the lionesses in Gujarat, and was getting over your fear, did it happen over time, or were you never fearful?
Oh, I'm certainly fearful. I'm an absolute coward. But at the same time, I think I grew up spending time in the forest as a child. So for me, the forest is not a frightening place. It's a familiar place in that way. So I have that advantage in the sense that it's something, because my parents took us camping, fishing out into the wild often, it's familiar. But you never get over that sense of anxiety, particularly when you're faced with a predator. There were moments when I was watching those king cobras in combat, and I was 4 or 5 feet away, and the snake itself is 12 feet. So, it's twice my height. And there were moments where I thought to myself, good God, what am I doing? This is the stupidest thing I've ever done. I took a few steps back at those moments. But you're also absolutely focused and fascinated by that particular species. The two female lions, there was I won't use the cliche of a heart-stopping moment, but when we came around the bush and saw them lying there, there was a moment where I thought we need to run. But there was also that sense of looking at them with complete intensity and not being afraid, or trying not to be afraid. Though I have to admit, there was this echo of fear, certainly in my head as I was watching them, because who knows what they might have done, though they certainly exhibited no hostility or aggression towards us.
And the last question for today is
Uh,
hunting.
Farooq, one question from me too. I just
Yes,
joined.
coming. Are hunting, grazing, and foraging banned in sacred groves?
In most, yes.
Mhm.
Foraging, for instance, in Meghalaya, at some of the sacred groves, people can go into the grove, and the rules are different in different places. But the way it was explained to me is that if somebody goes and picks a medicinal herb, or a nut or something like that, that they consume within the grove, it's permissible.
Okay.
People will also go and collect water from spring. Many sacred groves have a spring, so you can collect water, but you cannot break firewood and carry it out. You don't cut grass and take it out. You leave it in as pristine a condition as you can.
Indranil, your question.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Alter. I'll be very unabashed, and hopefully Farooq will not kill me for this. I'm an absolute fanboy.
Thank
I
you.
have been raving about your book since it has come
In
out. I have
in
read it.
all circles that we are common in.
So I've already read it twice, and I have gifted 4 copies. And because I have actually you write about stuff which I am quite passionate about wildlife and heritage. And most of the places you write about in your book, I have already been. Ajay, you write about ARAS, and Ajay actually is a good friend, and I've been there multiple times. And so basically, I was absolutely blown away by the book. I couldn't have been going around telling people that this is the best book of the year.
You're very
Now,
kind.
now with that over, I had one specific question. One place where history and heritage, or rather heritage and wildlife, come together, and nothing much has been done about it, are these forest rest houses. Okay, so in my extensive travels across India, I do have come across oral history where there seems to be a lot of history which people talk about relating to this forest rest houses. You touch upon a couple of them in your book, but there is a lot more to be done. And with the forest rest houses, going out of fashion very soon, is there any place, or is there anybody who's working on this? Because I have tried extensively to find out the history of the forest rest houses, but I have not been able to come to reach any literature. Question one, are you working on this? That would be fantastic. But other than that, are there any sources where we can tap into?
Yeah, well, it's an important question, and I think that various people have over time written about forest rest houses and things. But right now, actually, the person that I'm aware of who's doing the most detailed work on this is Raza Kazmi at Ashoka University. And he has been, I mean, he travels to wildlife sanctuaries, to forest blocks throughout India. And one of his primary interests is the history of these forest rest houses. And in fact, just 2 days ago, he sent me a photograph from the Forest Rest House Register in Kansrao near Dehradun, which contained an entry by my uncle from 1967, in which he jotted down that J.P. Alter and family had stayed one night at Kansrao, and they paid the chowkidar ₹5, and the chowkidar was very helpful. So Raza has been doing this, and I hope he will write more about that. Hopefully he'll produce a book. He'll certainly produce some articles. So he's the person I'm most familiar with in terms of people that are working on this. I'm sure there are others as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Indranil, you have two collaborators. If you just speak into the chat box, people who are interested, etc., in rest houses. All right. Thank you very much, Stephen. It was a real pleasure listening to you. The depth of your knowledge and the ease with which all the knowledge you shared was really something. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and please do attend some of our future talks.